Hey folks, Alistair here. This is kind of an odd one because there's nothing explicit on the page and it's all very subtly done. But the ending of this one is going to be difficult for some people. So if you don't want to be snuck up on by a story, then maybe consider meeting us for the Christmas story in a few days. And if not, stick around. I'll be along in a second. PseudoPod, episode 680, December 20th, 2019. This week's story, The Wild Wood by Mildred Klingerman. Hey everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. This week's story comes to us from the late, great Mildred Klingerman, whose existence is one of the rare and wonderful pleasures of this job. Every now and again, you find one of those authors that did amazing work and has been criminally overlooked, and you get a chance to help bring them back into the light, and Mildred's special. Mildred did some amazing stuff. Much of which was published in the 1950s in the magazine of Fantasy and SF, edited at that point by Anthony Boucher. Boucher included this story in the 7th volume of the Best from Fantasy and SF and dedicated a book to her, calling her the most serendipitous of discoveries. Klingerman was as strongly associated with F&SF as Zena Henderson. She was a founder of the Tucson Writers Club, served on the board of the Tucson Press Club, and was posthumously awarded the Cordwainer Smith Rediscovery Award in 2014. Your reader for this story is, much like Mildred Klingerman, an astonishingly talented female writer, but one that, as long as I draw breath, will not be allowed to become an undiscovered treasure or any of those terms which the industry seems so fond of using for writers that do excellent work but aren't white guys. No, much better than that. Karen Bovenmaier is the assistant editor at PseudoPod. Karen is also literally a teacher who teaches geniuses how to be geniuses. She's also my co-host on our Patreon show and is a fiercely talented writer in her own right. Karen is legitimately one of my favourite humans, and I am delighted to have her aboard for this episode. So, listen very closely, because Karen and Mildred have a story for you. And I promise you, it's true.
The Wild Wood by Mildred Klingerman. Narrated by Karen Bovenmaier. It seemed to Margaret Abbott that her children, as they grew older, clung more and more jealously to the family Christmas traditions. Her casual suggestion that, just this once, they try something new in the way of a Christmas tree met with such teenage scorn and genuine alarm that Margaret hastily abandoned the idea. She found it wryly amusing that the body of ritual she herself had built painstakingly through the years should now have achieved sacrosanctity. Once again, then, she would have to endure the secret malaise of shopping for the tree at Cravellini's Christmas tree headquarters. She tried to comfort herself with the thought that one wretchedly disquieting hour every year was not too much to pay for her children's happiness. After all, the episode always came far enough in advance of Christmas so that it never quite spoiled the great day for her. Buying the tree at Cravellini's began the year Bonnie was 4. Bruce had been only a toddler, fat and wriggling, and so difficult for Margaret to carry that Don had finally loaded Margaret with the packages and perched his son on his shoulder. Margaret remembered that night clearly. All day the Abbotts had promised Bonnie that when evening came, when all the shop lights blazed inside the fairy tale windows, the 4 of them would stroll the crowded streets, stopping or moving on at Bonnie's command. At some point along the way, the parents privately assured each other Bonnie would grow tired and fretful, but unwilling to relinquish the dazzling street and her moment of power. That would be the time to allow her to choose the all-important tree, which must then, of course, be carried to their car in triumph, with Bonnie as valiant, proud helper. Once she had been lured to the car, it would be simple to hurry her homeward and to bed. The fragrant green mystery of the tree, sharing their long ride home, would ensure her sleepiness and contentment. As it turned out, why hadn't they foreseen it? The child showed no sign of fatigue that evening, other than her captious rejection of every Christmas tree pointed out to her. Margaret, whose feet and back ached with Bruce's weight, swallowed her impatience and shook out yet another small tree and twirled its dark bushiness before Bonnie's cool, measuring gaze. "No," Bonnie said. "It's too little. Daddy, let's go that way." She pointed down one of the darker streets, leading to the area of pawn shops and narrow little cubbyholes that displayed cheap jewelry. These, in turn, verged on the ugly blocks that held credit clothiers, shoe repair shops, and empty boarded-up buildings where refuse gathered ankle-deep in the entranceways. "I won't," Margaret said. "This is silly. What is the matter with this tree, Bonnie? It isn't so small. We certainly aren't going to wander off down there. I assure you they don't have Christmas trees on that street. Do they, Don?" Don Abbott shook his head, but he was smiling down at his daughter, allowing her to drag him to the street crossing. Like a damn lumbering St. Bernard dog, Margaret thought, towed along by a simpering child. She stared after her husband and child as if they were strangers. They were waiting for her at the corner, Don with the uneasy, sheepish look of a man who knows his wife is angry, but unlikely to make a scene. Bonnie was still tugging at his hand, flashing sweet, smug little smiles at her mother. Margaret dropped the unfurled tree with a furious, open-fingered gesture, shifted Bruce so that he rode on one hip, and joined them. The traffic light changed, and they all crossed together. Don slowed and turned a propitiating face to his wife. "You all right, hon? Here, you carry the packages, and I'll take Bruce. If you want to, you could go sit in the car. Bonnie and I, we'll just check down this street a little way to make sure. She says they've got some big trees someplace down here." He looked doubtfully down at his daughter then. "Are you sure, Bonnie? How do you know?" "I saw them. Come on, Daddy." "Probably she did see some," Don said. "Maybe last week when we drove through town. You know, kids see things we don't notice. Lord, with traffic the way it is, who's got time to see anything? And besides, Margaret, you said she could pick the tree. You said it was time to start building traditions so the kids would have security and all that. Seems to me the tree won't mean much to her if we make her take the one that we choose. Anyway, that's the way I figure it." Margaret moved close to him and took his arm, squeezing it to show both her forgiveness and apology. Don smiled down at her, and Margaret's whole body warmed. For a long moment, she allowed her eyes to challenge his with the increased moisture and blood heat that he called smoky, and which denoted for both of them her frank desire. He stared back at her with alerted male tension, and then, consciously, relaxed. "Well, not right here and now," he said. "See me later." Margaret, reassured, skipped a few steps. This delighted the children. The four of them were laughing then when they found themselves in front of the derelict store that housed Cravellini's Christmas tree headquarters. Perhaps it was their gaiety, that first year, that made Cravellini's such a pleasant memory for Dawn and the children. For the first few minutes, Margaret, too, had found the dim, barny place charming. It held a bewildering forest of upright trees, aisles and aisles of them, and the odor of fir and spruce and pine was a tingling pleasure to the senses. The floor was covered with damp sawdust. The stained old walls hung with holly wreaths and Della Robbia creations that showed real artistry. Bonnie had gone whooping off in direction of the taller trees, disappearing from sight so quickly that Don had hurried after her. leaving Margaret standing just inside the door. She found herself suddenly struggling with that queer and elusive conviction that this has happened before. Not since her own childhood had she felt so strongly that she was capable of predicting in detail the events that would follow this moment. Already her flesh prickled with foreknowledge of the touch that would come now. She whirled to stare into the inky eyes of the man who stood beside her, his hand poised lightly on her bare forearm. Yes, he was part of the dream she'd returned to, the long, tormenting dream in which she cried out for wholeness, for decency and love, only to have the trees close in on her, shutting away the light. The trees, Margaret murmured. The dream began to fade. She looked down across the packages she held at the dark hand that smoothed the golden hairs on her forearm. I got those last summer when I swam so much. She straightened suddenly as the dream ended, trying to shake off the languor that held her, while a strange, ugly man stroked her arm. She managed to jerk away from him, spilling the packages at her feet. He knelt with her to pick them up, his head so close to hers that she smelled his dirty, oily hair. The odor of it conjured up for her again the small, cramped room and the bed with the thin mattress that never kept out the cold. Onions were browning in olive oil there, over the gas plate. The man standing at the window with his back turned. He needed her. Nobody else needed her in just that way. Besides, Mamma had said to watch over Alberto. How could she leave him alone? But Mamma was dead, and how could Mamma know all the bad things Alberto had taught her? Margaret! Don's voice called her rather sharply out of the dream that had again enveloped her. Margaret's sigh was like a half-sob. She laughed up at her husband, and he helped her to her feet and gathered up the packages. The strange man was introducing himself to Don. He was Mr. Cravellini, the proprietor. He had seen that the lady was very pale, ready to faint, perhaps. He'd stepped up to assist her, unfortunately frightening her since his step had not been heard, due, doubtless, to the great depth of the sawdust on the floor. Don, she saw, was listening to the overtones of the apology. If Mr. Cravellini's voice displayed the smallest hint of insolence and pride in the lies he was telling, then Don would grab him by the shirt front and shake him till he stopped lying and begged for mercy. Don did not believe in fighting. Often while he and Margaret lay warmly and happily in bed together, Don spoke regretfully of his wild kid days, glad that with maturity he need not prove on every street corner that he was not afraid to fight, glad to admit to Margaret that often he'd been scared, and always he'd been sick afterward. Don approved of social lies, the kind that permitted people to live and work together without too much friction. So Mr. Cravellini had made a mistake. Finding Margaret alone, he'd made a pass. He knew better now. Okay. Forget it. Thus Margaret read her husband's face and buried very deeply the sharp, small stab of disappointment. A fight would have ended it for good. She frowned a little with the effort to understand her own chaotic thoughts, her vision of a door that had almost closed on a narrow, stifling room, but was now wedged open, waiting. Dawn led her down one of the long aisles of trees to where Bonnie and Bruce were huddled beside their choice. Margaret scarcely glanced at the tree. Dawn was annoyed with her, half convinced, as he always was, that Margaret had invited the pass. Not by any overt signal on her part, but simply because she forgot to look busy and preoccupied. "Don't go dawdling along in that wide-eyed, dreamy way," he'd said so often. I don't know what it is, but you've got that look, as if you'd say yes to a square meal, or to a panhandler, or to somebody's bed." Bonnie was preening herself on the tree she'd chosen, chanting a maddening little refrain that Bruce would comprehend at any moment. "And Bruce, he didn't help." Already Bruce recognized that the sing-song words meant something scornful and destructive to his dignity. His face puckered, and he drew the 3 long breaths that preceded his best screaming. Margaret hoisted him up into her arms, while Dawn and Bonnie hastily beat a retreat with the excuse that they must pay Mr. Cravellini for the tree. Bruce screamed his fury at a world that kept trying to confine him, limit him, or otherwise squeeze his outsized ego down into puny, civilized proportions. Margaret paced up and down the aisles with him, wondering why Dawn and Bonnie were taking so long. Far at the rear of the store building, where the lights were dimmest, Margaret caught sight of a display of handmade candles. Still jogging Bruce up and down as if she were churning butter, she paused to look them over. 4 pale blue candles of varying lengths rose gracefully from a flat base molded to resemble a sheaf of laurel leaves. Very nice, and probably very expensive. Margaret turned away to find Mr. Cravellini standing immediately in front of her. "Do you like those candles?" he asked softly. "Where is my husband?" Margaret kept her eyes on Bruce's fine blonde hair. "Don't let the door open any more." "Your husband has gone to bring his car, he and your daughter. The tree is too large to carry so far. Why are you afraid?" "I'm not afraid." She glanced fleetingly into the man's eyes, troubled again that her knowledge of his identity wavered just beyond reality. "Have we met before?" she asked. "I almost saw you once," Cravellini said. "I was standing at a window. You were reflected in it, but when I turned around, you were gone. There was nobody in the room but my sister, the stupid cow." Cravellini spat into the sawdust. "That day I made a candle for you. Wait." He reached swiftly behind the stacked packing boxes that held the candles on display. He had placed it in her hand before she got a clear look at it. Sickeningly pink, loathsomely slick and hand-filling. It would have been cleaner, more honest, she thought, if it had been a frank reproduction of what it was intended to suggest. She dropped it and ran awkwardly with the baby toward the lights at the entranceway. Dawn was just parking the car. She wrenched the door open and half fell into the front seat. Bonnie had rushed off with Dawn to bring out the tree. Margaret buried her face in Bruce's warm, sweet-smelling neck and nuzzled him till he laughed out loud. She never quite remembered afterward the ride home that night. She must have been very quiet, in one of her lost moods, as Dawn called them. The next morning she was surprised to see that Bonnie had picked one of Cravellini's largest, finest trees, and to discover the tissue-wrapped pale blue candles he had given Bonnie as a special Christmas gift. Every year after that, Margaret promised herself that this year she would stay at home on the tree-buying night. But something always forced her to go, some errand, a last bit of shopping, or Dawn's stern injunctions not to be silly, that he could not handle Bonnie, Bruce, and the biggest tree in town. Once there, she never managed to escape Cravellini's unctuous welcome. If she sat in the car, then he came out to speak to her. Much better go inside and stick close by Dawn and the children. But that never quite worked either. Somehow the 3 of them eluded her. She might hear their delighted shouts 2 aisles over, but when she hastened in their direction, she found only Cravellini waiting. She never eluded him. Sometimes on New Year's Day, when she heard so much about the resolutions on radio and television, she thought that surely this year she'd tell Dawn at least some of the things Cravellini said to her, did to her. Enough, anyway, to assure the Abbotts never going back there again. But she never did. It would be difficult to explain to Dawn why she'd waited so long to speak out about it. Why hadn't she told him that first night? She could only shake her head in puzzlement and distaste for motivations that were tangled in a long, bad dream. And how could a woman of almost 40 explain and deeply explore a woman in her 20s? Even if they were the same woman, it was impossible. When Cravellini's opening announcement card arrived each year, Margaret was jolted out of the peacefulness that inevitably built in her between Christmases. It was as if a torn and raw portion of her brain healed in the interim. But the door was still invitingly wedged open, and every Christmas something tried to force her inside. Margaret's spirit fought the assailant that seemed to accompany Mr. Cravellini, hovering there beyond the lights, flitting behind the trees. But the fighting left her weak and tired and without any words to help her communicate her distress. If only Dawn would see, she thought. If there were no need for words, it ought to be like that. At such times she accused herself of indulging in Bruce's outgrown baby fury, crying out against things as they are. Every time she saw Cravellini, the dream gained in reality and continuity. He was very friendly with the Abbotts now. They were among his oldest customers, privileged to receive his heartiest greetings, along with the beautiful candles and wreaths that he gave the children. Margaret had hoped this year she could convince Bonnie and Bruce to have a different kind of tree, something modern and a little startling, perhaps, like tumbleweeds sprayed pink and mounted on a tree-shaped form. Anything. But they laughed at her bad taste and were as horrified as if she were trying to bypass Christmas itself. I wonder if I'll see her this year, Margaret thought. Alberto's sister. She knew so much about her now, that she was dumb, that she had acute, morbidly sensitive hearing, that once she'd heard Cravellini murmuring his lust to Margaret, because that was the time of the animal grunting. Laughing sounds had come from the back of the store, where the extra trees lay stacked against the wall. Her name was Angela, and she was very gross, very fat, very ugly. Unmarriageable, Alberto had said. Part of what Margaret knew of Angela came from Alberto's whispered confidences. Unwanted, unasked for. And the rest grew out of the dream that lived and walked with Margaret there in the crumbling building, beginning the moment she entered the door, ending only with Dawn's voice, calling her back to sanity and to another life. There were self-revelatory moments in her life with Dawn, when Margaret was able to admit to herself that the dream had power to call her back. She would like to know the ending. It was like a too-short book that left one hungry and dissatisfied. So this year she gave way to the children, to tradition, and went once again to Cravellini's. Margaret was aware that she looked her best in the dull red velveteen suit. The double golden hoops at her ears tinkled a little when she walked, and made her feel like an arrogant gypsy. She and Dawn had stopped at their favorite small bar for several drinks while the children finished their shopping. Maybe it's the drinks, Margaret thought, and maybe it's the feeling that tonight, at last, I'll settle Mr. Cravellini, that makes me walk so jut-bosomed and proud. Dawn, already on his way with her to Cravellini's, had dropped into a department store with the mumbled excuse that always preceded his gift-buying for Margaret. He had urged her to go on alone, reminding her that the children might be there waiting. For once, Margaret went fearlessly, almost eagerly, The children were not waiting, but the woman was. Angela. Margaret knew her instantly, just as she'd known Alberto. Angela stared up and down at Margaret and did not bother to hide her amusement or her knowledge of Margaret's many hot, protesting encounters with her brother. Margaret started to speak, but the woman only jerked her head meaningfully towards the back of the store. Margaret did not move. The dream was beginning. Alberto is waiting there beyond the stacked high Christmas trees. See the soft, springy nest he has built for you with pine boughs. Margaret stirred uneasily and began to move down the aisle, Angela beside her. I must go to him. He needs me. Mamma said to look after Alberto, that I would win for myself a crown in heaven. Did she know how unnatural a brother Alberto is? Did she know how he learned the 7 powers from the old forbidden books and taught them to me? He shall have what he desires, and so shall I. Here, Alberto, comes the proud, silly spirit you've won. And listen, Dawn and the children are coming in the door. Margaret found the soft, springy bed behind the stacked trees. Alberto was there, waiting. She heard Dawn call for her and struggled to answer, struggled desperately to rise, to go to him. But she was so fat, so heavy, so ugly. She heard the other woman's light, warm voice answering, heard her happy, foolish joking with the children, her mock protestations, as always, at the enormous tree they picked. Margaret fought wildly and caught a last glimpse of the abbots, the 4 of them, and saw the dull red suit the woman wore, heard the final flirtatious tinkling of the golden earrings. And then they were gone. A whole year I must wait, Margaret thought, and maybe next year they won't come. She will see to that. My sister, my love, Alberto crooned at her ear.
Isn't this weird? Isn't this weird? In fact, 2 different ways. Societally, it's an odd one for me because it shows me the other side of one of my biases. I have a serious problem with the use of sexual assault in horror, unless it's done for completely bulletproof plot reasons. The genre still has a reputation in a lot of places that's in the gutter, and for me, as a host, gratuitous sexual assault and animal cruelty are the 2 fastest ways to get me to nope out. There are others. There are also instances where assault has been used in, I hesitate to say good reasons, but in a way that works in context. I read a lot of Poppy Z. Bright at a formative age, for example, although, as ever, your mileage may vary, but for me, it worked there. The horror here is the violation, then. That's a given, but that doesn't mean we get to look away. In fact, Klingemann wraps the horror inside a labyrinth of terror that mirrors Halid's own. The never-ending year-long countdown, the hope that one year it won't happen, the prison of accretion stopping her from telling people. This is how abuse works, because this is abuse, documented with the clear eye of someone who sees it for what it is and won't break eye contact until it backs down. This is awake, aware, perceptive writing, which makes it all the more horrifying. Then, of course, there's the ending. The other side of the mirror, the hints at what else the Cravellinis do, and from a modern perspective, the inevitable awareness that this is a story where foreigners are evil and no dark magics that bind innocent American consumers. A nightmare wrapped inside something which still provides, comfort for so many, and all of it orbiting consumerism, like the endless, shiny, gunmetal sun it is. Nightmares inside nightmares, truth inside horror. Fiction inside the comforting, deceptive, near universal experience. We are lost in the wild wood, and having guided us in, Klingemann drops our hand and runs. expertly done.
Do you find most perfumes reek of banality and bad French puns? Do you want perfumes that resonate with your dark heart and blackened soul? Do you want perfume that speaks to you, the discerning PseudoPod listener? Allow me to introduce you to the fine perfumers of Black Phoenix Alchemy Lab. Black Phoenix's fragrances take inspiration from grand myths and tall tales, the height of camp to the depths of decadence, the lightest of fantasy to the blackest of horror. You can experience scents based on titans of literature like William Shakespeare, Lewis Carroll, and H.P. Lovecraft, to modern storytellers like Clive Barker, Kelly Sue DeConnick, and Neil Gaiman. Their perfume oils are lovingly hand-blended using only the finest ingredients. Based in the City of Angels, they will send their creations far and wide to satisfy your needs. Peruse their vast catalog for enticing aromas, or maybe some nail polish, atmosphere sprays, candles, and other sundries. You can also travel to live events and sample their wares and meet the staff in the flesh. All this and more can be found at blackphoenixalchemylab.com. So go ahead, indulge yourself.
Thanks to both the Klingemann estate and to the magnificent Karen Bovenmeier. And now over to you. You see, we need you. We rely entirely on donations to pay our servers, our staff, our authors, and that last cost in particular has gone up this year. As the SFWA increased the pro-qualifying rate to 8 cents a word, that's a 2 cent a word bump. We pay that. Our donations have not increased to cover that. So we're stretched, and we have been all year, but we pay that because we believe it's the right thing to do, and also because what we're working towards is being able to fund that and paying slush readers. Slush readers are the unsung heroes of the industry. Everyone uses them, everyone needs them, almost no one pays them, and we want to be one of the first. And for that we need you. There are 2 ways you can donate. The first is to go to pseudopod.org and click on Feed the Pod. There you can subscribe and gain access to our audio vault full of hidden treasures. You can do the same thing over at Patreon, but there are higher levels of donation too, including some pretty sweet merchandising, if I do say so myself. And if you can't do that, and we understand some folks just can't, then please consider tweeting a link to an episode or leaving a review or talking about it. Trust me, it does really all help. We'll be back next week. In fact, we'll be back in a few days, on Christmas Day no less, with A Night of Many Months by C.L. Holland, and read by, again, one of my favourite humans, the amazing Dave Robertson. Then, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. And I leave you with this quote: "The perceptions of a child who has not yet learned to protect itself by developing the tunnel vision that keeps out 90% of the universe." Stephen King, The Mist. Spillage in Aisle 3. See you next week, folks.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.